Thanks for tuning in to Operation Revenge. Make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Now let's begin the story. I stood at the entrance of the military function, my fingers tightening around the invitation in my hand. The night air was crisp, but I barely noticed. My eyes were trained on the glass doors ahead of me, through which I could see them, Luke and Dad, laughing, talking, enjoying the spotlight like they always did. I'd been invited, but not to stay, just to deliver a few files to the reception desk, a final formality. The officer at the door gave me a polite, almost apologetic smile. He'd been briefed, no doubt. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said, his voice stiff. "You'll have to leave the documents at the reception." I nodded, my throat tight. I could feel the weight of their gazes through the glass doors, even though they didn't know I was there. Luke's laughter echoed out, slicing through the buzz of the room. "Hey, look who's here," he called out, his voice cutting through the noise like a knife. The ghost of missions past. I felt it. That stab of ridicule, sharp and raw. Though he didn't mean it, he was just doing what he did best, shining in the spotlight while I remained a shadow, my work always behind the scenes, the sacrifices invisible to anyone who mattered. I looked down at the documents in my hand. A few forms, a file no one would read, no one would thank me for. The system was built on these invisible contributions, and I had become the ghost in my own life. I started to turn away, to walk out of the function, when a voice interrupted me, firm, commanding. "Evelyn." It was Darius Langley, retired commander. His presence cut through the noise like an old, familiar anchor. He'd been a mentor to me once, back when I mattered to more than just the files I processed. He stepped into my line of sight, his eyes locking onto mine, and I could feel the room pause. "Don't you think you should be in there?" he asked, his voice low, but loud enough for anyone close to hear. "After all, you're the one who saved this operation." The room fell silent, and for a moment, it was just me and Darius, standing at the door, him with the weight of his respect, and me with the sting of rejection. My heart hammered in my chest as his words hit their mark. He didn't wait for a response. He didn't need to. He just nodded toward the guests in the room, who were now shifting uncomfortably in their seats. I felt the sudden weight of their eyes on me. The invisible work I'd done for years, the sacrifices, the time spent in the shadows, all of it finally coming to light. Slowly, I walked past the door, stepping into the function. The silence that followed felt heavy, like a weight pressing on my chest. I didn't need to be validated by anyone anymore. But in that moment, I couldn't help but feel the quiet satisfaction of the truth, undeniable, unspoken, and stronger than any applause, and I walked out. I spent a lot of time thinking about the difference between Luke's heroics and my own. I used to tell myself it didn't matter, that I was just doing my job. But the older I got, the harder it became to ignore the truth. Luke was the one getting the praise. Luke was the one in the spotlight, the one with the medals, the one who always seemed to be the hero. I wasn't jealous. I never had been. I was proud of him. I truly was. But I'd been invisible for too long, and it was starting to eat at me. When I joined military intelligence, it wasn't for the glory. I wanted to make a difference, to protect our country. But unlike Luke, whose feats were always public, my work was classified. Everything I did, all the hours spent combing through endless data, pulling apart pieces of information no one else could see, it all faded into the background. No one outside the department knew who I was. And in the eyes of my family, I was just the quiet, serious one, always with my head down, always in the background. I never resented Luke for the attention he got. He deserved it, more than anyone. He'd faced dangers I would never have the courage to face. But even so, every time we gathered as a family, I felt the sting. My father, with his hard eyes and stern expectations, never looked my way when he praised Luke. "Luke's done more than most could ever dream of," he would say, his voice a low rumble of pride. And me? Well, I'd never done enough. I knew how it sounded in my head. "You're just the one who fills out the paperwork, Evelyn. You're just the one who catches the small things everyone else misses. You're the one who keeps things running, but only behind the scenes." When I was younger, I thought if I worked hard enough, if I made sure everything was perfect, they'd see me. Maybe they'd finally understand. But as the years passed, I started to see the truth. They didn't care about my work. They didn't care that I'd uncovered a critical intel breach months before it exploded in the press, or that I'd saved countless lives by identifying enemy movements no one else could. To them, my role was small, invisible. And then there was Luke, standing in the middle of our father's praise, his laughter filling the room. He had the respect of the world, the recognition of everyone who mattered. I couldn't even get a damn thank you for the years I'd spent fighting a different kind of war, one where the enemy wasn't out there on the front lines, but buried in numbers, in files, in hidden messages no one else could read. The silence I'd learned to endure, the invisibility, it was the only way to survive in this family. If I spoke out, I'd be the one who upset the balance, the one who brought the truth to light, the one who dared to demand recognition. So I stayed silent. But over the years, that silence became a shield. And though I still longed for the recognition, for someone to finally see me, I learned to tell myself that it didn't matter. It had to be enough that I knew the truth, that I had done my job, that I had served, even if no one ever knew. But inside, it gnawed at me, just a little bit, every day, a quiet, unspoken resentment. I wasn't invisible because I was weak. I was invisible because I had learned to be, and that silence, it was killing me. It wasn't often that Luke and I were assigned to the same mission, but when we were, the tension between us was palpable. He was SEAL Team, the face of the operation, the man who would lead the charge. And me, I was intelligence, silent, unseen, running the numbers in the background, the one who caught the anomalies before anyone else did. I never resented the way the world saw him, but when it came to something this important, something this dangerous, I couldn't help but feel like my role was reduced to mere paperwork. Operation Scythe was supposed to be a routine mission. The intel was clear, the window for action narrow. But I saw something others missed. A discrepancy in the data, a signal that didn't match, a pattern that didn't fit. It was subtle, so subtle. But I knew it meant trouble. I flagged it in the system, and immediately I felt that familiar weight of indecision. I knew what I had to do. I had to warn them. I had to make sure they didn't walk into a trap. I sent my alert through the secure line, hoping my words would reach the right ears. The situation was urgent, time-sensitive. A trap was set, the clock ticking down on us, and I needed them to listen. I needed Luke to listen. But of course, he didn't. Luke's voice crackled through my earpiece just minutes later. "Evelyn, I know you flagged this, but the mission's a go. We've got a narrow window, and I can't afford delays." I tried again. "Luke, please, this isn't what it seems. There's an anomaly. If we push through, we'll walk right into—" "We don't have time for your theories," he cut me off. His voice was sharp, but there was an edge of frustration too, as though he was already tired of hearing my warnings. "We've trained for this. Trust the plan." The plan. My stomach turned. I trusted the plan. I always had. But this felt different. This felt wrong. I could feel my hands trembling as I keyed in the override request, but I knew it was futile. They were going forward, no matter what. Luke had the authority. The command was his, not mine. I heard the distant hum of the engines as the SEALs prepared to go in. There was no turning back now. "Evelyn, we're moving out," Luke's voice came again, more distant now, swallowed by the noise of the operation ramping up. "Sit tight. We'll handle it." Sit tight. I was already sitting tight. I was already on the sidelines. I wasn't the one out there, making the hard calls. I wasn't the one risking my life. But my mind raced, the feeling of helplessness gnawing at me, because deep down, I knew what was coming. I knew the trap was real, but I also knew that there was nothing I could do to stop it. I watched the status updates flash across my screen. Everything in motion, everything progressing. I'd flagged the anomaly. I'd done my job, but no one was listening. Not Luke, not the commanders, no one. The mission proceeded. The countdown clock continued ticking down, and I watched, helpless, knowing that my brother was walking straight into a storm, and I was powerless to stop it. An hour later, the first casualty report came through. Then another, and another. I could barely breathe as I scanned the data, the familiar coldness of failure creeping into my bones. "Evelyn," Luke's voice crackled again, only this time, it was raw. "We're hit. We've lost men." My heart stopped in my chest. The weight of those words crashed into me like a wave. The numbers I'd seen were no longer just numbers. They were men. They were people. And I had known this would happen. I had warned them. But in that moment, it didn't matter. The operation was lost, and I was left with nothing but the cold sting of truth. Luke's decision, his refusal to listen, had cost them, cost us, everything. I wasn't just an observer anymore. I wasn't just the invisible one who sat behind the screen, watching the mission unfold. Now, I held the truth, the painful, undeniable truth that would change everything. But it came at a cost. The cost of knowing that even if I spoke now, it wouldn't change a thing. The damage was done, and I was trapped. Trapped in a system that would bury the truth, just as it always had. The aftermath of Operation Scythe was a blur, a haze of reports, paperwork, and quiet grief that no one would speak aloud. The mission had been a disaster, and the higher-ups had already moved on. But I couldn't move on. Not yet. I sat alone in my office, the weight of the failure hanging in the air like smoke. The mission logs were filled with discrepancies, omissions, half-truths. Luke's name was everywhere, front and center as it should be. He was the hero, the one who led the charge, the one who would take the accolades. But as I flipped through the operations reports, my eyes kept landing on the small, almost invisible details. The things they had erased, the truths they had buried. It was the same every time. My name wasn't there. My warnings weren't there. My heart was heavy as I sifted through the data, piecing together the timeline. I could feel my hands shaking as I started to dig deeper into the mission logs. The operation had been deliberately misrepresented. Luke had altered the mission timeline to cover his own mistakes, to protect his reputation and save face. He had erased me from the record, just as he'd always done. I wasn't surprised. But that didn't make it hurt any less. The more I uncovered, the more it felt like the walls were closing in. I knew what I had to do. I couldn't just let this go. I couldn't let the truth remain buried. So I gathered the evidence, the altered logs, the discrepancies in the reports, the emails with the warnings I had flagged. I had everything I needed to expose the truth. But the thought of it made my stomach churn. Exposing Luke, my own flesh and blood? But what choice did I have? I wasn't the one who had caused this. I wasn't the one who had ignored the warnings, who had led the team into disaster. I was the one who had tried to stop it, the one who had seen it coming and had been dismissed. But my silence had only made things worse. I couldn't stay silent anymore. So, with a cold, steady resolve, I packaged everything up, every email, every log, every detail. And I sent it. I sent the truth to the military ethics office. Anonymously, of course. I knew nothing would change. It never did. But it was something I had to do. I had to make sure the truth was out there, even if it didn't change the past. The moment I hit send, I felt a sick sense of relief, followed by a deep emptiness. I had done what I could, but it wouldn't bring back the men we had lost. It wouldn't bring back what was already broken. Weeks later, the results came back. Luke was temporarily reassigned. It was a small victory, but it felt hollow. My name was still nowhere in the official records. I was still the invisible one, the one who had warned them, the one who had seen it all before anyone else. But it didn't matter. The system would always favor the ones who were in the spotlight, and I was still alone. I didn't get a thank you. I didn't get an acknowledgement. Not from Luke. Not from anyone. The silence continued, a heavy, oppressive weight that I could never shake off. Even as Luke's career was reevaluated, as the system reluctantly moved him aside, I knew my own place was set in stone. I was the one who held the truth, but I was the one who had been erased from the narrative. The silence after the storm wasn't just the quiet of failure. It was the quiet of being invisible, the quiet of being forgotten, and it was starting to feel like the silence would never end. A week passed, then another, and still nothing changed. My office felt smaller every day. The hum of the fluorescent lights above me was the only sound in the sterile, impersonal space I now occupied. Fort Gordon was miles away from the front lines where I once thrived. The distance was literal, but also figurative. I had been relegated to a desk job, isolated and forgotten, a shadow of the person I used to be. They didn't even give me a proper reassignment. It was as if they'd put me in a corner and hoped I would disappear. Just another casualty of the military machine. My new role? Administrative. I shuffled through paperwork that meant nothing, ticking boxes on forms that felt like they would never end. It was a quiet death, the kind that doesn't come with explosions or gunfire, but with the slow, suffocating realization that your work, everything you've done, doesn't matter. Not anymore. My name wasn't on the mission reports, not even as a footnote. My warning had been ignored, erased, as if it never existed. But there were still files to go through, still data to analyze, still things to learn. The need for control was still there. I couldn't stop. I wasn't ready to let go of the person I used to be, the one who mattered. And so, in the silence of my new life, I began to rebuild. I signed up for online courses, something to fill the emptiness. Cybersecurity, data manipulation, anything that might give me the skills to see beyond the edges of the system, to understand the forces that kept me stuck in this place. It wasn't the kind of work I had imagined for myself. It wasn't the kind of work I'd trained for, but it was something. At night, when the world outside my cubicle had long gone dark, I sat in front of my laptop, devouring lessons and textbooks. Slowly, I began to build a new system, one that could detect silences, the ones that lay buried deep within military operations, the kind of silences that covered up truths like mine. I knew I couldn't change the past, I couldn't undo the damage, but maybe, just maybe, I could find a way to uncover the truth again. I wasn't going to be erased. Not again. I started quietly collecting information, gathering patterns, organizing the data in a way that made sense. It wasn't much, but it was mine. It was something I could control. Still, I could feel the isolation creeping in, settling in my bones. I was learning to accept it. I was learning to live in the quiet. But every now and then, I thought of the days when I had mattered, when my contributions had been visible, and that made the silence seem a little louder. The worst part wasn't the work, it was the absence of recognition, the absence of acknowledgement. My family, Luke, Dad, still didn't know what had happened, still didn't know what I had done. They had never asked, they had never cared, and it was too late now to hope for something that would never come. But in the solitude of my office, surrounded by files and forgotten reports, I started to feel something else growing inside me. It wasn't pride, not yet, but it was something. I didn't need their recognition. I didn't need to be seen by them anymore. The truth was mine, and in time, I would find a way to make it known. In the meantime, I would rebuild. I would find a new way to be useful, a new way to be visible, not in their world, but in mine. And that was enough. For now. A year had passed since I was reassigned to this quiet life. The daily grind had worn me down, but something unexpected had also started to take root in the silence: resilience. I didn't know it at the time, but the work I had begun to do, studying cybersecurity, analyzing patterns in data, creating new systems to detect hidden anomalies, was more than just a distraction. It was a rebellion in its own way. Quiet, under the radar, but a rebellion all the same. The long hours I spent alone at night, hunched over my laptop, had finally paid off. I had written my thesis. It wasn't much at first glance, just another paper on the flaws within military reporting systems, the silences that allowed corruption, failure, and manipulation to thrive. But to me, it was everything. It was my quiet revenge, my way of exposing what I knew was wrong, even if no one would ever read it. I published the thesis under a false name. A pen name? I didn't want the credit. I didn't need anyone to know it was mine. What mattered was that it existed, out there, in the world, and that someone might read it, someone who could make a difference. I didn't expect much. I never did. The military system had crushed me once already, and I wasn't fool enough to think I could change it. But I couldn't just sit back and do nothing, not after everything, not after the lives we had lost, the truths that were buried, the recognition I would never get. This, at least, was something I could do. A couple of months later, something surprising happened. My thesis, the one I'd written in anonymity, had been leaked. It had caught the attention of someone who had known exactly what to do with it. I didn't find out about it until the email came. It was from Chief Mason Briggs. He was a survivor from Operation Scythe, a man who had seen the worst of what we had endured. I had never met him personally, but his name was well known, and the fact that he'd survived the hell of that mission meant something. He was someone who had been there, someone who knew what had really happened. The email was simple. Evelyn, I read your thesis. I knew it was you even before I finished it. I've known the truth all along, but like everyone else, I stayed silent. I stayed quiet to protect the system, but I can't anymore. We need to talk. The weight of those words hit me like a shockwave. I hadn't expected anyone, least of all someone from the field, to acknowledge me, to recognize what I had done. But Mason Briggs did, and with that recognition came a sense of validation I didn't know I needed. We met at a tech symposium a few weeks later, my first real engagement with someone who had shared my experience, who understood the weight of the truth. He was older, graying at the temples, but the fire in his eyes was unmistakable. I've read your work, Evelyn, Mason said, his voice low but firm. You were right about everything, the operation, the reports. Luke didn't just fail, he lied. And the rest of us, we let him, we let it happen, because it was easier to stay quiet. But you were right. I felt the weight of those words settle in my chest. He had seen the truth, he had known all along, and he wasn't just acknowledging it, he was admitting his own complicity in the silence. There was no anger in his voice, just regret. I can't undo what happened, Mason continued, his voice thick with emotion. But I want you to know, your work hasn't gone unnoticed. It's not just you. There are others who feel the same way, and we're not going to stay silent anymore. For the first time in years, I felt something stirring inside me. Not hope, not quite, but the recognition I'd longed for. The understanding that I wasn't alone in this fight, in this need to expose the truth, however painful it might be, was enough to keep me going. Mason and I didn't exchange many words after that, but I didn't need to. His acknowledgement was all I needed to know that I wasn't crazy for believing that the truth was worth fighting for. And with that, a shift began. Not an explosion, not a revolution, just a quiet unraveling of the silence that had bound us all. The system couldn't keep us all quiet forever. We were starting to speak up, starting to be heard, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough. For now. I left the symposium that day with a sense of quiet strength, knowing that the truth, though buried for so long, had not been forgotten. It was still out there, alive and waiting to be uncovered, and for the first time in years, I felt the weight of the past begin to lift. The ceremony honoring SEAL Team 9 was supposed to be a standard affair. Another round of awards, a few speeches, some photos, and then everyone would go home. But when I walked into the room, I felt something shift. The weight of the years of silence, the years of being erased from the story, hung heavy in the air. Luke was there, of course, standing at the front, the center of attention. I'd seen him in moments like this before. He was always the one who commanded the room, the one who was acknowledged, praised, and admired. But this time was different. This time, I wasn't on the sidelines anymore. This time, they would have to recognize me too, even if it was just a fleeting moment. As the ceremony unfolded, I sat in the back, arms crossed, watching the familiar ritual. When the MC finally announced Luke's award, the Medal of Strategic Valor for Operation Scythe, the room erupted into applause. He stood up grinning, a proud look on his face, nodding at the crowd, basking in the recognition he had always craved. And then the MC said something that froze me in my seat. There is also another contributor to this operation, someone whose efforts were essential to its success, but who remained behind the scenes. The truth about her contributions was overlooked for too long, but we cannot let that happen anymore. Evelyn Langley's work in military intelligence was the key to our survival. I almost couldn't breathe. My name echoed in the room, and for the first time in years, I felt the eyes of the crowd on me, not with disdain, not with pity, but with recognition. The applause that followed was hesitant at first, as if the room wasn't sure how to react, but it grew steadily. A few seconds later, I stood up, and the room followed suit. I wasn't prepared for this. I wasn't prepared for the room to acknowledge me, for them to stand and clap as if I was part of something bigger than myself, but I wasn't part of it. Not really. I hadn't been part of it for years. The truth, though, couldn't be erased anymore. I had exposed the lies, and even though the system had tried to bury me, I wasn't invisible anymore. Luke's eyes found mine across the room. His smile faltered for a brief second before he quickly composed himself. I didn't know what he was thinking, but I knew this moment had shaken him. For the first time, he was forced to see me, not as his little sister, not as the one who always stayed in the background, but as the person who had saved him, who had saved all of them. The applause faded, and I sat back down, my heart still racing. Luke made his speech, the usual platitudes about teamwork and sacrifice, about the men who had fallen, about the mission. It wasn't much, it was what I expected. But it didn't matter. The truth had already been spoken. I was seen, even if it was just for a moment. After the ceremony, as the guests mingled and celebrated, Luke approached me. His expression was unreadable, but there was something there, something unspoken. "I never wanted you to be erased, Ev," he said quietly, his voice hoarse. "I never meant for that to happen." I met his gaze, holding his eyes for a moment before I spoke. "It didn't have to happen, Luke. It was never about you. It was about the truth that everyone tried to ignore, and that I was forced to carry. For too long, no one saw me. No one saw the work I did. But now they do." He nodded, but it was clear that the weight of it all was sinking in. "I'm sorry," he said. The words simple, but they held more weight than I expected. "I should have listened to you." I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. Not to him, not to anyone. The truth was out there, and that was enough. As I walked out of the room, I didn't feel the rush of victory that I thought I would. Instead, I felt calm. The weight of years of silence had finally been lifted, and in its place, there was only the quiet satisfaction of knowing that I had been right, that I had done what was needed, even when no one else could see it, and that, in the end, was enough. The ceremony had ended, the applause still echoing in my ears as I walked through the lobby, trying to shake off the weight of the past few hours. I should have felt victorious, but there was a hollow emptiness creeping in, the same feeling I always had after these moments of recognition. It wasn't about the applause, it wasn't about being seen. It was about the years I'd spent in silence, the years I'd spent fighting a battle no one knew I was waging. And then, as I stepped toward the exit, I felt it, the presence behind me, unmistakable. Ev. I turned, and there he was. Luke. His face was drawn, his jaw tight, his eyes still carrying that strange mix of admiration and something else. Something I hadn't seen in him for years. Guilt, maybe, regret, perhaps. But there was something heavier there now, something that hadn't been there before. I waited for him to speak, but he didn't. He just stood there, watching me like he was waiting for me to say something first. For a moment, I just stood there, the weight of everything pressing on me, trying to make sense of the emotions that were threatening to overtake me. Finally, I broke the silence. "You're here," I said quietly. It wasn't a question. I didn't need to ask why, not after everything that had just happened. "I came to talk," he said, his voice rough. I didn't know what to say before, but I need to say something now. I raised an eyebrow, not sure if I wanted to hear what he had to say, but I nodded anyway, waiting. He looked down at the floor for a moment, gathering his thoughts before speaking again. "I didn't understand what you went through. I didn't understand how much you did, how much you sacrificed, how much you carried. All these years, I just assumed you were fine. I didn't see it, and I should have." The words were simple, but there was something in them that hit me harder than I expected. Not because of what he was saying, but because it was the first time I'd ever heard him say it. The first time I'd heard him admit that he had failed me. "I know I've been a shit brother, Ev," he continued, his voice faltering. "And I've done things that I can never undo. But I need you to know that I see you now. I see what you did. I see what you've been through. And I'm sorry." I didn't know how to respond to that. The words were heavy, but they felt too little, too late. My entire life had been spent in the shadows of their expectations, of Dad's, of Luke's, of everyone who never took the time to truly see me. And now, after all of it, after everything I had sacrificed, it felt like the apology didn't mean anything. Still, I couldn't bring myself to dismiss him outright. Not yet. Not when there was so much left unsaid, so much left between us. "You should have seen me," I said softly, my voice trembling despite myself. "You should have seen what I did, what I gave. I was always there, Luke. Always in the background, always doing the work no one else wanted to do. But you never saw me? Not really." He took a step forward, his gaze never leaving mine. "I'm sorry for that," he said, his voice thick with regret. "I was selfish. I took everything for granted. And I can't change that now, but I need you to know. I see you. I see what you've done. And I'm proud of you, Ev. You're not invisible to me anymore." The words hit me harder than I expected, and for a moment, I thought I might crumble. But I didn't. I held it together. I had to. "You can't undo the past, Luke," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "You can't undo the years I spent in silence, the years I spent pretending it didn't matter. But I'm done pretending. I'm done staying in the shadows." He nodded, his eyes softening. "I know," he said quietly. "I just hope you can forgive me." I met his gaze for a long moment, searching his face for the sincerity I needed. And in that moment, I realized something. I wasn't going to forgive him. Not right now, not in this moment. But I wasn't angry anymore. Not like I used to be. There was just emptiness. A quiet understanding that we were both broken in different ways. And maybe, just maybe, that was all we would ever be. "I'm not ready for that," I said finally. "But maybe one day, I will be." Luke nodded, the weight of my words settling between us. "I understand." We stood there for a long time, the silence stretching between us. Not uncomfortable, but not comfortable either. It was the silence of something unfinished, something still broken, something that might never be fixed. Finally, I turned to leave. "I'm done with the past, Luke," I said, my voice steady. "And I'm done trying to fix everything. It's time for me to move on. I hope you can do the same." I didn't look back. Not this time. I had nothing left to say to him, to anyone. The silence was mine now, and I would carry it however I chose. As I stepped into the night, the weight of everything, the years of sacrifice, the years of neglect, the years of silence, finally began to feel like something I could leave behind. It wasn't about forgiveness anymore, it was about freedom. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I could finally breathe. I left my family behind, and it wasn't as hard as I thought it would be. The decision had been made a long time ago. I just hadn't realized it until now. When I stepped out of that house, when I finally walked away from all the expectations, the apologies, the guilt trips, I could feel the weight lifting off my shoulders. My new apartment wasn't much, just a small place in a quiet building on the edge of town. It wasn't the kind of place I'd ever pictured myself in, but it felt right. I didn't need much anymore. No expectations, no phone calls demanding my attention, no apologies that came too late. I set my things down, unpacked the few boxes I had, and then sat by the window, staring out at the street below. It was quiet, too quiet after everything, but the stillness was different now. It was mine. I wasn't surrounded by the noise of my past, the constant need for validation or forgiveness. I was alone, and for the first time in a long time, I realized that I was okay with it. I spent the next few weeks settling into my new routine. I enrolled in a few more classes, picking up skills that interested me, things that felt like mine, not dictated by anyone else. I worked through my days in a calm, steady rhythm, and in the evenings, I'd read or study or take long walks through the city. My life was small, but it was mine. There were moments when I'd wonder about my family, about Luke, about everything I had left behind. But those moments were rare. The truth was, I didn't miss them. Not really. Not anymore. Max, my son, came to visit one weekend. He had his own life now, his own struggles, his own victories. I made him his favorite breakfast, and we spent the day talking about everything and nothing. It felt good to just be a mother again, to be present for him without the weight of the past dragging me down. He left that evening, and I found myself back in my apartment, alone with my thoughts. The silence was still there, but it didn't feel suffocating anymore. It was peaceful. It was the kind of silence I'd been craving for years, and then one evening, a letter arrived. It wasn't from anyone I expected. There was no return address, no indication of who had sent it. But when I opened it, I found a small note, handwritten, simple. You were right. I should have listened. Thank you for being the truth. Mason Briggs. I sat there holding the letter in my hands, feeling a strange warmth spread through me. Mason had been part of the system. He had seen the truth. He had been a part of the silence that had tried to bury me. But now, here he was, acknowledging the work I had done, the truth I had uncovered. I hadn't done it for recognition, but I couldn't deny that hearing it from someone who had been there, that felt good. For the first time in years, I felt like I was part of something again, not in the way I had once imagined, not in the way I had hoped my family would finally see me, but in a way that was real, in a way that was mine. The letter wasn't going to change my life, but it was a sign, a small but significant acknowledgement that the truth I had fought for had reached the right people, that maybe, just maybe, I hadn't been as invisible as I had thought. I put the letter on the table and smiled, just a little. It wasn't much, but it was enough. I stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the night sky. The city below was quiet, still, alive with possibility, and for the first time in a long time, I felt the weight of everything I had left behind. The betrayals, the disappointments, the silence fade into the background. It was gone, and I was free. This was my new beginning, and I was finally ready to live it on my own terms.